Hey everybody, Matt from 90th percentile.ca here. For access to more study notes, practice questions, mock exams, and end of chapter question videos, visit 90th percentile.ca and sign up for your free trial today. Link below in the description. For this learning module, we're talking about international trade and capital flows. Once again, pretty quick module, not too many end of chapter questions. Questions are relatively simple, like not quant heavy, but regardless, main two topics we're going to talk about are the benefits of international trade and the types of trade agreements that are in place. So, whether or not a country can benefit from international trade is going to depend on its comparative and absolute advantage in producing the good, and the types of trade agreements that we can have. They can be simple agreements between like one or two countries. They can be, all the way at the other end. They could be a country that is a monetary union that not only has coordinated economic policies but also shares the same currency. But we'll go over the spectrum of these different trade agreements and describe all of them. And then moving on, we're also going to be talking about restrictions of international trade and the balance of payments. So some restrictions that countries can put in place are tariffs, import quotas, and export restraints, to name a few. We'll go over and we'll have a little graph that describes how these different restrictions benefit the overall well-being of a country, and how in theory, a country can technically increase the overall well-being of its economy by imposing tariffs. We'll explain that. And then finally, some more definition stuff where we're talking about the current account, capital account, and financial account, which are essentially really just like categorizations of different accounts in a country's balance of payments or trade flows, which are used to categorize, if you're selling goods and services, it'll flow into one account and be measured in one account. Whereas if you're, trading like financial instruments, it'll be in a different account. But like I said, mainly just used to categorize and keep an eye on where the majority of a country's trade is coming from and going to. So with that, we'll just jump right in. Which of the following statements best describes the costs of international trade? A, countries without an absolute advantage in producing good cannot benefit significantly from international trade. That's incorrect. If they don't have an absolute advantage, which is being able to produce a good at a lower cost than another country, they could also have a comparative advantage, which is producing the good at a lower opportunity cost. In this case, the country could benefit from international trade. We'll get into an example of that in a bit, but this is not the answer. If we're going to B, resources may need to be allocated into or out of an industry, and less efficient companies may be forced to exit an industry, which in turn may lead to higher unemployment. So this is true, right? You can think of what happened in the US with car manufacturing. They weren't maybe efficient isn't the best word, but they weren't as cost efficient in creating some of these cars and the parts, etc. So they offshored a lot of their jobs to Mexico, which of course, wasn't met with good reception in the public eye, because a lot of US people lost their jobs, which led to higher unemployment. Suppose three countries produce bananas and pencils with output per worker per day. And each country is followed. So we have Mexico, Canada, Brazil, Mexico, Brazil, Canada. We have bananas per worker per day and pencils per worker per day. Which country has the greatest comparative advantage in the production of bananas? Canada, Brazil, or Mexico? So like I said earlier, right, so comparative advantage is the lowest opportunity cost. So we can just standardize these or, reduce the fractions to compare them. So for Mexico, they can either produce 40 pencils or 20 bananas. So 40 over 20, and this is bananas. So they can produce 2 pencils per banana. Brazil, kind of the same thing. Here we have 90 pencils or 30 bananas, so 90 over 30 equals 3 per banana. And then finally, Canada can do over here. 160 pencils are 40 bananas. 160 over 40 is 4 pencils per banana. So the comparative advantage is the one that has the lowest opportunity cost, which would be Mexico, because they can, you know, produce bananas and only have the opportunity cost of missing out on the production of 2 pencils, right? So in this case, the greatest comparative advantage is Mexico, and Mexico would benefit from international trade by exporting bananas, even though they're not the most efficient producer of it. In the Ricardian trade model, a country captures more of the gains from trade if what? Well, before we go through these answers, let's go through a quick overview of what the Ricardian model is. Once again, just another one of those economic theories. And this theory states that differences in productivity amongst countries are only due to technology differences. So how productive a country is at producing a good is only due to technology. So if we're coming to A, will a country capture more gains from trade if they produce all products while its trade partner specializes in one good? No. The whole idea of absolute and comparative advantage still applies. And then we have a couple here saying in B, we have the terms of trade are closer to the autarkic prices than to its partners' prices. The terms of trade are closer to its partners' autarkic prices than to its autarkic. Okay, so it's talking about the terms of trade, so the price that it's receiving, is closer to its autarkic prices. So an autarkic price is the price of a good in a country that is completely shut off from international trade. So if you remember in the geopolitical quadrant that we had autarky all the way over here, which was nationalist, nationalist, and then non-cooperative. So they were completely shut off from the world, right? So an autarkic price is the price of a good in a country that doesn't have any trade with international countries, which is a good in that country, assuming that they can only get the good in that country and they produce the good in that country and all that. So um, for a company here to benefit, the price difference between the price they receive and the autarkic price is going to have to be big, right? But it has to be the autarkic price in the country that they're selling to, because it's assumed that the autarkic price in this country, if it has a comparative advantage, the price can be a lot lower. Um, so like the price they receive is going to have to be closer to the autarkic price in the other country for there to be a big spread, because the other country doesn't really specialize in production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The price is going to be higher in that country. So the answer here is going to be the terms of trade are closer to the partner's autarkic prices than to its autarkic prices. So it's going to be the gap here, and it's going to cause the biggest gain. Germany has much more capital per worker than Portugal. In autarky, each country produces and consumes both machine tools and wine. We have 2 goods. Production of machine tools is relatively capital intensive, whereas winemaking is labor intensive. According to the Heckscher-Ohlin model, when trade opens, what should Germany do? So the Heckscher-Ohlin model, a little bit different than the Ricardian model, which we just went over this. It said differences in productivity are due to technology differences amongst countries, but here we have differences in productivity are due to the relative supplies of capital and labor. So we have 2 factors. So the relative supplies of capital and labor in each country. So a country that has relatively more of either capital or labor should export goods associated with with the factor that they have an abundance of in order to benefit from trade, right? So here we have Germany has much more capital, and production of machine tools is capital intensive. So if they already have so much capital and they don't have a lot of labor for wine, then what they should do is they should export what they have an abundance of, so machine tools, and import wine. right? So that's going to be right here. Um, yeah, we have Germany exporting machine tools, and I guess the flip side of that, of Germany importing wine, is Portugal exporting wine, same thing. Which of the following trade restrictions is likely to result in the greatest welfare loss for the importing country? So to answer this, we have a graph here which we took from the curriculum. We have the domestic demand of a good here, and domestic supply of a good here. In an example with price right here, P star, we have demand being greater than supply. So we're going to have imports filling this quantity, right? So if we're using the example of a tariff, basically what's going on is the government's increasing the price, right? They're putting a tax on the imported good to increase the price, right? So now the price of the good in the domestic country is higher, or the importing country is higher, and domestic producers of the good are going to benefit from this area here because now they're, producing a greater supply at a greater price. So the area, shaded A is the benefit to domestic producers. The area in C is the government tax revenue, right? Because now their price increase this much. This is the difference is the tax or the tariff that they put on, and they are receiving this tax revenue on the new amount of the import. So where demand exceeds supply. So the area in C is the government revenue from the tariff. The whole idea around the tariff is that the net benefit of the area in A, so producer benefit and government benefit, is greater than these what are called deadweight. I'll color them a different color, but B and D are effectively called deadweight losses, which are the net, um, the negative impacts of the price increase for consumers in the domestic country, right? So the whole idea is that if A and C, so these blue areas, the net benefit is greater than the red areas, tariffs can actually benefit a country overall. So that's kind of the gist of it. If we're looking at the question, which of the following trade restrictions is likely to result in the greatest welfare loss? So like I said, tariffs can actually, in theory, benefit a country, so that's not going to be the answer. The answer is actually a voluntary export restraint. And the reason why is because by restraining exports, you're actually going to drive the price of the good up to here. But in this case, the domestic government isn't getting this tax revenue right here, right? All the difference in the new price and the quantity demanded is all accruing to the foreign exporters of the goods to be able to supply the demand in the domestic market. So in a voluntary export restraint, all the benefit is really going to the foreign country, so it's not going to benefit the domestic country. Here we're talking about some different types of agreements and different categories of agreements that countries can have related to international trade. Before we answer the question, we'll just look at the 5 definitions that we have in the book. So one is a free trade area, FTA, pretty kind of common sense. So just 2 countries that have free trade agreements, like no tariffs or anything. Going down the list, you can kind of think of this like as a waterfall, where the next one down the list has all the characteristics of the one above, but plus something else. So a customs union is the same thing as a free trade area, but they also have a common policy versus other non-member countries. A common market is a customs union and a free trade area by definition. So common market is customs union plus they have free flow of production factors, so like labor and capital. And then an economic union is a common market, but with common economic policies. And a monetary union would be an economic union, but they just have the same currency. So, example of this would be like the EU. Toughest one to remember from like a definition perspective, like in my opinion, is this one here. Just one of those definition things that unfortunately you have to remember. Common market is, remember, they have free flow of production factors. Everything else is pretty pretty easy to remember. Like monetary union is on the extreme, monetary, money, same currency, all that. Anyway, coming back to the question, if Brazil and South Africa have free trade with each other, so they got this, a common trade policy against all other countries, got this, but no free movement of factors of production between them, so they don't have this. So by definition, they're going to be a customs union, which is your answer. Here, we're talking about some different accounts that are considered or categorized in the balance of trade of a country. They're really just used to categorize um, trade flows, and each account has different definitions of what's included in it. So we can go over it really quickly. A current account basically just measures the trade of goods and services between two countries. So, you know, like trading whatever, like cars, trading watermelons, whatever. And then services would be maybe like tax advisory or something across border, something like that. Whereas capital account is dealing with capital transfers, so it could be something related to, like large equipment. It could be related something related to natural resources. This is more like long term in nature. Like if you're, going back to one of our earlier learning modules with the short run aggregate supply curve and long run aggregate supply curve, the way I like to think of this is it's more related to shifts in the long term supply curve. And then finally, we have the financial account, pretty self-explanatory. We're talking trade of financial assets, either domestic owned or foreign owned, anything like that. So with that, we have a couple questions. And the first one here, the sale of mineral rights would be captured in which of the following balance of payment components? So mineral rights is a natural resources, so they're selling the rights to, mine minerals in a different country. Not related to the current account, because this isn't technically goods and services. Like if they were trading the minerals themselves, it would be in the current account, but they're trading the rights to it, which is capital. So it's going to be capital. And then for the next one, patent fees and legal services are recorded in which of the following accounts? Once again, services, you have legal services here, so it's going to be in the current account. Which of the following most likely contributes to a current account deficit? So the current account, we kind of just went over it, but it's also known as net exports. So X minus M, we're familiar with this. And then going forward, once again, we kind of touched on this in an earlier module, but through some substitution of the typical GDP formula, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, you can figure out through some algebra that's outside of the scope of the curriculum and using some substitution and all that, in theory, net exports is actually equal to private savings plus government savings less investment. So, kind of a similar thing to the relationship between the government fiscal deficit savings and net exports in the one of the earlier modules is just another formula you can remember because they can ask you a lot of questions about like if government saving increases, what does that imply for the current account? If investment increases, what happens? And if you just remember this, relatively easy formula, there's a bunch of different questions that you can answer properly. So going back to the question, which of the following most likely contributes to a current account deficit? So a deficit is when your imports are greater than your exports. So what will make this lower, right? So we can look at the formula and just go one by one. High taxes, I mean, they're kind of just throwing that in there. If you really wanted to stretch, you could say, taxes increase or will decrease private saving, less money on hand, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You could overcomplicate it and, you probably would be justified. But once again, we're not trying to overcomplicate here. We're just staying within the confines of the curriculum. So then if we're going to B, what contributes to a current account deficit? Low private savings. So if private savings is lower, this is all going to be lower. So that's our answer. C would be low private investment. So if this decreased, because you're subtracting it, the current account would actually increase, right? So B is the answer. Which of the following chronic deficit conditions is least alarming to the deficit country's creditors? So if a country's in a big fiscal deficit, current account deficit, whatever, and there's foreign countries providing the debt, or buying the debt when the deficit country is issuing the debt. They're providing credit to that company, obviously, right? So what's least alarming if a country always has a massive deficit? It's going to be high private investment, right? So if they have a big deficit, but they're using that money to expand and invest, the idea is that somewhere in the future they're going to have better productivity, a better balance of payments, all that, and the economy will overall be more productive and more smooth. If you're looking at something like high government spending, uh, it's obviously pretty concerning. Like if a country is issuing a bunch of debt and they're just using all that money to spend, as opposed to like invest, um, then it's not a good sign. They're kind of just burning through cash, right? So the private investment in the private sector is going to be the least concerning.